So we're very excited to talk with you today about this from a real practitioner perspective. And I'd like my panelists who are here joining me to introduce themselves, and we'll get started. Susan?
Hi, everyone. My name is Susan DeSantis. I'm the Chief Compliance Officer for the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation. I've been with DTCC for 22 plus years, so I've seen a lot.
Lynda?
I'm Lynda Witter. I am the Senior Audit Manager for Audit Technology at BMO Financial Group out of Toronto, Canada. I've been with BMO for only 13 years.
Newbie.
That's right. So, yep.
And Melissa?
Good evening. My name is Melissa Borrelli. I am with Mazars USA. I actually have a dual role. I am part-time in the General Counsel's office because I'm an attorney. And then the rest of my time, I am in healthcare consulting. So I assist folks in the healthcare sector with compliance, regulatory affairs issues.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Today's session, we're going to really cover in a couple of different sections. The first section we're going to talk about is the vision that these three panelists had as they set about thinking about governance, risk, and compliance, how they then aligned their vision or think about aligning their vision with business, what are some of the costs and benefits, how did they address change management and adoption, and then what were some of the lessons learned. So we'll start off with the vision. And the first question I have to the panelists, and Susan, maybe I'll start with you, is what path led you personally into this world of governance, risk, and compliance?
Personally, as I mentioned, I've been with DTCC for a long time, but I've only been in compliance for about 7 years. I made a career for myself going to places to solve problems nobody else wanted to touch. So I guess it makes a lot of sense that I wound up in compliance. There's been, as you know, in the financial services industry, a lot of regulatory change. When I first started, we had virtually no second-line functions in existence. Now we have quite a bit, and with the spring up of all of these second-line functions, we were just tripping over each other. A lot of our processes were duplicative. We were asking for the same things in different ways. The first line was getting very frustrated with us, and the regulators, quite frankly, were getting very frustrated with us. So that's when we decided that we needed to coordinate, to harmonize, and to get our act together.
That's great. Melissa, what about you?
Yeah, I have sorry. I feel like I'm talking very loudly. An interesting background. Again, I'm an attorney, so I have, most of my work has been in the legal field. And I had the opportunity to go to work for the government agency in California that regulates healthcare plans. And so that was my first real deep dive into this notion of compliance. From there, I went in-house working for a healthcare services plan in California, and my role was director of compliance and senior attorney. And under that, I had multiple areas of compliance, so not just regulatory compliance. Also had privacy, information security, all of those broad areas that, because it was a smaller company, we all became sort of a jack of all trades. And it was there that I really started to realize the difficulty, the challenges in compliance, but the opportunities as well. And the possibility that you don't have to run your department by Excel was very, very exciting for me. And the more I started to dig into what tools were out there to make my job easier, to make our risks go down, to make the board happier, the more I realized how wonderful the GRC tools are and how much they really can do, especially being in an in-house position with very few resources. So.
And Lynda, I know BMO has always had a very successful audit program. What led you to the world of GRC?
So I think for BMO Financial Group, we have a very strong audit program. A lot of folks were concerned with our system was out of date, and yet they wanted to ensure that they kept the strong program that they had. We had a really great team come together to look at systems to replace the audit product that we had. We did all the right things. We did RFP, we checked the boxes, we knew what we wanted from an audit perspective, and we were down to our top 3. I know Susan was a big part of that process with us. And, I was ready to pitch to our leadership, hey, we've got 3 really strong systems that are great for audit, and I think maybe we should just take the cheapest one because they will all do, everything that we dreamed of in the future. And interestingly enough, the big boss said to me, don't just think of audit. Think of other groups that we can collaborate with. Think of, the journey ahead, and really, what company do you want to hold your hands through the, little bumps along the way in your road? Because, we had a couple. I'm sure you did too. Just a few bumps. Yeah. But also, that's right. And also, she had said to me, think about the other clients. Think about who else you're swimming down the stream with, right? And always being the big fish in the small pond is not always the best. So, it really gave me an aha moment when we were going through those systems, and I really took to heart the folks we were working with, and we called a lot of companies. We called, I don't know if I should say who they are, but with and without MetricStream, and we learned some great things, and we bypassed some of those potholes in the road, specifically because those folks came forward and helped us out and told us what to expect. And really, I don't know what the cost is on that, but I thank them. And we really learned to leverage some of those friendships. And so now that we're, skipping down the road as opposed to slowly navigating our way, I feel like, what's that game show, where you get to call a friend, and phone a friend. And if you call a good friend, you'll get the $1 million, right? So I'm really looking forward to building relationships with other MetricStream clients and seeing what their pitfalls have been, sharing our story, and adding a nice big list of people to call when we start, integrating and doing a lot more stuff with the system.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that, Lynda. Melissa, you mentioned that the promise of GRC to you was this ability to displace a lot of these manual processes and implement, technology that would provide some efficiencies. But certainly, it wasn't just all smiles, was it? So, what were some of the challenges, and how did your vision for value change as you kind of went through your process?
So a few things. One, when I first started looking for a tool, it was partly out of ignorance. It was just looking for something to hold our written PMPs. I just want something that makes it easier to access them, easier to get them reviewed, updated, all of those kinds of things. But as I delved deeper into this GRC world, and saw just so many other capabilities. Some of them I had just never even dreamt of in my role working on compliance and risk management. And so it was very exciting, very, very exciting process, learning the different functionalities, the reporting, just the way to gather data so that it makes sense across the entire company. There were some pitfalls, though, for sure. It is never, in my opinion, never wise to assume that everyone in the company is going to be on board with the direction that you want to take or the new software program that you want to implement. Excuse me. Folks live in their own worlds. They have their own issues, their own matters that they have to deal with in their departments. So to come and say, hey, look, I've got this really great, shiny new tool, and it's going to do all these things. Aren't you excited? And no, most of them are not. They're not excited. So one of the things that I learned was to try and get buy-in from the very beginning, build the relationships, particularly with those departments that you're going to be working with on a regular basis in implementing a GRC software program. Additionally, we had language barriers in the sense that there's a separate set of language in every industry, in every sector, but also with GRC software. So not everybody spoke the same language when we were in compliance rattling, certain terms off of our tongues. It didn't necessarily make sense to everybody else. So another opportunity when you get that buy-in and you build those relationships is to ensure that they understand the GRC speak, because you definitely want to be speaking the same language when it comes to something as big as a GRC implementation.
Susan, you mentioned to me that your initial vision and the value promise was really about some of the automation and efficiency for the second line of defense, but that kind of changed as things went on. Tell us about that.
Well, it was actually this. We have a lot of things that we do within the second line of defense, really driven by regulation and then feedback from our regulators. We will try to comply with the regulation and then get feedback that maybe we should be doing it a different way. So that creates a great business case for your investment and operating committee when the regulator tells you that thou shalt do something. So we actually started building all of these different disparate solutions. And then we started to realize that we should start talking to each other. We should start sharing. And then we formed what we called a second line of defense harmonization committee. And this was well before looking at a software solution. And we gained some real efficiencies by doing that. And then we started thinking, well, let's bring internal audit into the conversation. And then finally, we were able to convince the first line to take some initially participate. But it really wasn't until our senior executive team kind of got it and started really talking the talk, and then we were able to really get the first line engaged. And the first line took it upon themselves to implement a management control testing program. I've actually witnessed firsthand first line senior management speaking to our board members about their understanding of the control environment. So it's been actually very successful for our organization.
That's great. That's great. So now as you think about the initial vision and some of the things you've learned along the way, there's certainly been this time where you've been able to think about how you're aligned with the business. So would you want to start, Susan? The alignment with your business, where do you see that besides regulatory examination? Where else are you seeing alignment with your program?
Gosh, we are aligning in a lot of different ways. We're really collaborating. We're actually going through a initiative, this is very recent, with our business transformation office to streamline processes across vendor management. So we have our third-party risk management program. We also have a cloud council that reviews any type of SaaS solution going to the cloud. We have a lot of different disparate architecture processes, and we're looking to streamline that for the voice, listening to the voice of the customer, streamlining those processes to make it easier for the customer, which is basically somebody who's in product or IT, to onboard a vendor.
Lynda, what about you?
I think for us, our culture really has been shifting to a unify, simplify, accelerate culture. All of the groups are doing it, and it's great because more and more of our groups are working together to to come up with some great solutions. And when everybody in the bank knows that there's really not an end, right? That there is just going to be continuous improvement forever until we simplify enough until it makes sense. I think there's more people who care, who really want to make a difference. And, you know, I see it more and more every day. People are looking now to the Book of Records and asking to integrate as opposed to just making their own. For example, we pull from the HR Book of Directory for our org level, whereas before we just entered in our own org level. So these are just, you know, great steps, and I just see it going.
So you mentioned once it's a system of record for, is it for issues that if it isn't in MetricStream, it doesn't exist? Was it issues or control gaps or failures? No?
I'm not sure.
No, okay, sorry. Melissa, over to you then. On the, we talked a little bit about the roadblocks in some of this alignment. What were some of the roadblocks that you encountered?
So one of the things I actually talked about in the panel that I was on earlier is how far back in the GRC maturity model generally the healthcare industry is. We are not even as, we're leaps and bounds away from finance and other highly regulated industries. We're just starting to understand what GRC is, let alone bring it in, implement it, and do it well. Some of the roadblocks, though, that of course I mentioned before, is not everybody is happy about another thing that they have to do or another way that they have to do it, particularly if it's seen as being onerous, taking more of their folks' time that they don't have. So one of the things that I try to, when I'm helping a client implement this, that I try to think about is having those conversations with the other stakeholders. So asking them what their pain points are, and if possible, showing them how GRC can, in the long run, make that less painful or take the pain away completely. There are all sorts of regulatory requirements in healthcare. We generally follow the 7 elements of an effective compliance program. And so we're, can make the case more easily that having written policies and procedures in one place makes sense and has not only can lower risk, but can have fantastic efficiencies. Training is a huge part of healthcare, and one of those 7 elements, and to the extent that a GRC program can assist with that and bringing things all together, again, getting those roadblocks out of the way. Another thing that I like to think about, especially when I'm speaking with second line of defense folks, is what are your pain points? And one of the points that I heard over and over and over again, and I think it's a problem in every industry and every business, frankly, is employee accountability. So your ability to train folks can sometimes be difficult. GRC can help with that. Your employees following policies and procedures, again, GRC helps with that. But if you can make that value proposition for the leaders, for the supervisors, the managers, and even up, as to how they can utilize the tool to help them with employee accountability, generally I've been successful with saying, hey, if we can get this in place, and then if you've got that troublesome employee who just doesn't seem to want to follow the rules or is causing any number of problems, you can use this tool to help you make the case for whatever it is, retraining that person, new position on the bus, off the bus. So there are definitely roadblocks, but there are things that you can do internally to get past those roadblocks.
Great, thank you. So one of the other topics that we've heard this week is this focus on reputational risk. And I was just wondering, how do you integrate your work to demonstrate reduced reputation risk? Susan?
Yeah, you know, we were actually talking about the fact that it's very hard to put a dollar amount on a enforcement action or regulatory finding from a reputational perspective. But there's a lot to be said for not having examination findings, for finding issues at the first line and self-identifying those issues and quickly fixing those issues. So, you know, one of the biggest areas that DTCC feels where we have reputational risk is in our good name from being held in good standing with our regulators. We're all about risk management. We're all about reducing risk for the industry. And for us to you know, be on the front page of the Wall Street Journal would really not be a good thing. So it's a great argument for GRC, for senior management, because it's really avoidance of those types of incidents.
Do any of you do scenario analysis around risk and kind of walk through different what-if examples?
I've done some informal versions of that with some clients, and it's fascinating. It's very similar to business continuity tabletop exercises and going through that what-if scenario. And it's very powerful. It can be very powerful because there are enough headlines out there in the healthcare sector and in a particular company's industry that you can point to and say, what if that happened to you? What if that happened to us? And, you know, there's so much data and information out there now in this media-filled world that it's a lot easier to take those newspaper headlines, bring them in, and go through that process. And you know, some reputational risk, you can't get rid of all of your risks, right? You can't control every risk, but to the extent that you can be prepared for them, to the extent that you can look and see what others in your industry are facing and then try and deal with that before you become the next one in the newspaper. And it's something you should definitely be doing.
Is this a formal program that you're doing quarterly, twice yearly? How often do you do that, Susan?
For us, it's a very formalized program because it's really driven by some of the rules that we have to adhere to with the Covered Clearing Agency standards. And we have a number of different types of scenarios that are extreme but plausible. And one of the things that we are incorporate into our tabletops around these exercises is how do we communicate with the public. Many of these scenarios would result in something happen with the markets in terms of end-of-day settlement, something that would impact our ability to perform settlement, like a cyber event. So we have to think very carefully about how we address that with external parties, our clients, the world at large.
Let's switch to costs and benefits. And as you're, maturing down the path with your implementations, what are some of the benefits that you're measuring? I know, Lynda, you mentioned your reporting. Could you tell us about that?
Sure. So we report to the board quarterly. We have approximately 300 staff that my team supports. And, their work bubbles up. And we collect data across at the time. Before we implemented MetricStream, we were grabbing data from some different systems to create the board reporting we needed. I would say we had about 2 full-time staff, full week, easy, working through the weekends just to produce the integrated data we needed for the directors, et cetera, to go through it and fix it. And then we'd do it again, and we would be up to like 50 versions sometimes, depending on what was going on, before we could even mail out the materials. So we have gone from that painful process to a reporting directly out of MetricStream. We ensure that we have all the issues in MetricStream, and I when I find problems or I'm missing an issue, I make sure that they go into the system and that we go through and make sure that everything's correct there. And then we'll re-report, because now it takes a couple hours just to spit things out, put it in a format. And really the energy is just to make it pretty before we send the materials out. So you're looking at a couple of versions. And I think we've gone to maybe a couple hours.
So from weeks?
Huge.
Weeks with 2 people
Yes.
to hours.
Yeah, and we've now continued to use visualization dashboards so that our staff can see things before quarterly reporting, before, 2 weeks cut off before we send out the reports, and that's when you could see your data. Now you can see your data pretty much any day you'd like.
Great. I know, Susan, you have metrics that you are measuring with regard to issues and actions and other areas. Can you tell us a little bit about the metrics and how that kind of equates to benefits?
Yeah, we are actually, we're working under a corporate objective to, we actually have a corporate goal to further our GRC journey, which is great. So now I've got the whole corporation behind it, but we have metrics around the percentage of management self-identified issues. We've also implemented a change in our process where we now count second-line sourced issues as management source, because we are a part of management. We're not independent like audit. So we're doing really well from that perspective in terms of identifying the issues at the front line, getting them fixed before an audit, before an examination. We've also incorporated a lot of metrics, and a couple of panelists today have talked about metrics around conduct, and associated that with our insider risk program, and are able to demonstrate to the board any sort of issues around code of conduct violations or policy violations, which in these days they're very interested in.
Melissa, anything from your side in terms of the benefits?
Yeah, again, coming from the healthcare perspective and not being nearly as advanced as other industries, we're still learning what we can, what data we can gather, how we can look at it, the metadata that we can get from that, and how that can improve operations, lower risk, those kinds of things. And it's difficult, because how do you value an enforcement fine that never happened, right? But in addition to just those standard regulatory reporting requirements, we're starting to look beyond that and see other risks, like HR risks. Do we have a lot of churn in one department? That can be a risk. What's going on there? So again, we're just starting to branch out and see what else we can do, in addition to the government needs X, Y, Z, ABC data from us this quarter.
Great, thank you. So we'll move into the topic of adoption and expansion, because that's always a little challenging. And a number of our customers have started to push their GRC down to the front line of defense. This creates a new set of users, which is great, but it also creates perhaps a new set of challenges. First of all, how engaged is your first line of defense, and how are you supporting them? Why don't we start, Susan, with you?
Well, I'm very fortunate, because our first line is very engaged. We do have dedicated business risk staff in the first line, and they sort of act as a liaison between the product managers and the folks in IT who maybe experience the incidents or have to remediate the issues or are subject to a regulatory examination, and kind of help bridge the gap with the second line and third line functions. So that's been very, very positive experience. We generally have the typical whinging and moaning about having to use a system or change. Nobody likes change, even if change is better. And so we do, like a lot of other panelists have talked about, you have to spend a lot of time communicating, coaching, holding people's hands. We started the concept for our TPRM program of establishing office hours If you have to do a third-party risk assessment, you're not sure how to do it, you can either call or walk into a conference room and get some help to figure that out. So really takes a lot more hand-holding than you would think. I would say, whatever you think you need to do, double it.
Melissa, what about you?
So it's, of course, very dependent on the company and their culture. But again, wearing my healthcare sector cap, you absolutely have to have your first line of defense folks involved, even if it's extremely difficult, even if it's extremely onerous, which typically it is. Those are the folks where the rubber hits the road, and in my opinion, where you have your highest risk of things going wrong. And in healthcare, you literally have people's lives at stake. So it's too important not to have those folks bought into the concept, but also trained on how to raise issues, how to second guess, how to question something that doesn't quite make sense to them. And especially, again, in healthcare with the data that is there. It's all sensitive data, all of it. There's no data that we don't worry about. So making sure you've got your first line folks handling that data as carefully as possible, hugely important, huge.
So before we close, I just would like each one of you to maybe share some thoughts on lessons that you've learned and advice maybe for the audience, regardless of where they are in their journey. Susan, why don't we just start and walk down?
I'm sure all of you probably have heard this before, because I've heard it a couple of times in the conference, but the amount of time and effort that it takes to work with your cross-functional groups to identify your foundational elements is critical, and it is so important with the subsequent implementation of automation. My advice is whatever you think it is, quadruple it. It's going to take longer, and you're going to really hone your negotiation skills.
With the rest of your businesses.
Yes.
I'm going to go out on a limb, because I do that from time to time. And I just want to ask everybody, I know it's like almost 6 o'clock, and you really just want to get out of here probably, but can you raise your hand if you have been part of an MSIG discussion? MSIG, yeah, there's a few, okay. Can you raise your hand if you have been in that online community? Has anybody logged into that? Wow, some people left their hand up. That's pretty. I want you to be my friend. Can you find me? Because I would say, when your head's down and you're just trying to get your stuff sorted out and everybody happy, and you want to run and have the best system you can have. I forget sometimes the value that I got out of talking to some of the other customers when we first started. And really, now that we're skipping, and I really say my hindsight's 50-50. And in talking to a lot of the folks the last couple of days, and their hindsight's 50-50, we have found a lot of commonalities, a lot of stuff that we have, had to configure the same way or even customize, things that really we want to push to be platform-wide. And it's great that our project teams come together and they have a system, but your project team needs to be pretty loud. So connect is my suggestion. Connect whenever you can. We are now starting to look at, the future and the great things we want to do moving forward to leverage the platform. And, I want to reach out. I want to find out who's doing what, where they suggest I don't go, and where they suggest I do. And I really hope that more people can get together, maybe use the online community. I know I'm bad for that, but I'm going to work on it. So Cruise, those people who had their hands up tonight, I'll be at the cruise, find me. I need a longer list to call a friend. I'm going to win that million one day.
Melissa?
Yeah, I mean, I echo what Lynda and Susan said, and I'm going to echo myself from a few minutes ago, which is, in my opinion, it's all about relationship building. It's this really wonderful tool, does some really wonderful things, but not if you don't have everyone on board. And so I would not only, recognize that everything is going to take longer than you realize, that you need to actually back up even further and start having conversations with your stakeholders and start building relationships. And frankly, show them how it will help them, because that's the question they're going to have. If they don't say it out loud, it's going to be in their head, what's in this for me, right? This is yet one more thing you're asking us to do, and you're asking my people to do. So get built in from your first, your second, your third level. I think it's especially important with the top-down culture. So starting from the top, maybe the best way, but you can't ignore the other layers. You've got to build relationships. You've got to show folks how this will help the company, how it will help them, how it will help their operations, their employees, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you. Well, I think we have time probably for one or maybe two questions. Do we have any questions out there? Okay. So I'd like to thank Melissa Borrelli from Mazars and Lynda Witter from Bank of Montreal and Susan DeSantis from DTCC for their insightful comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.